The fine rain drummed on the diner's awning, creating a monotonous melody that filled the silence of the place. Ruth stood behind the counter, cleaning the same spot for the third time. The clock on the wall read 1:37 a.m. Business had been slow that night, as was usually the case on weekdays. Despite this, Ruth maintained her composure. Her white blouse, though worn, was impeccably clean, and her warm smile was like a ray of sunshine in a cloudy sky. The diner doors swung open, bringing in a gust of cold wind and the figure of a man. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and his expression weary. Ruth looked up, and something about him caught her attention. It wasn't just his appearance, but the way he looked around, as if carrying the weight of 1,000 worries. "Good evening," she said, approaching with a notepad. "Can I help you with something?" The man hesitated before sitting at the nearest stool by the counter. "A coffee, please," he replied, his voice hoarse, as if he hadn't spoken in hours. Ruth prepared the coffee with the precision of someone who had done it for years. When she placed the cup in front of him, she noticed his hands trembling as he held it. "Is everything all right?" she asked gently. The man let out a heavy sigh, averting his gaze. "I've had better nights," he admitted, stirring the coffee without actually drinking it. After a long silence, he finally looked at Ruth. "I think I lost my wallet." She raised her eyebrows, surprised but not judgmental. "Are you sure? Maybe it's in your car, or—" "No," he interrupted. "I don't have a car. Someone must have stolen it on the bus." The confession lingered in the air. Ruth noticed the embarrassment on his face. Before he could say anything else, she eased his worry. "It's all right. You can pay next time." The man seemed ready to protest, but instead began removing an old watch from his wrist. "Please, take this as a guarantee. I wouldn't feel right leaving without paying." Ruth shook her head firmly, but kept her tone soft. "You don't need to do that. I trust you. Just come back when you can." "All right." He stared at her for a moment, as if trying to understand why someone would be so generous to a stranger. Finally, he nodded with a small smile, more grateful than he could express. As the man left, Gina, who had been tidying up the tables in the corner, approached with a sarcastic laugh. "You're way too nice, Ruth. That kind of attitude isn't going to get you anywhere." Ruth sighed, but remained calm. "I prefer to believe that kindness still makes a difference." Gina rolled her eyes. "You'll regret being so naive." Ruth didn't respond. Instead, she looked at the door the man had walked through, wondering who he was and why he seemed so lost. Gina's words echoed in her mind, but she brushed them aside. After all, being kind was the only way she knew how to live. The morning sun cast long shadows across the humble diner as Ruth arrived early, the weight of exhaustion from the previous night still heavy on her shoulders. The place was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional clink of a coffee cup being set down. She adjusted her apron, trying to shake off a lingering unease she couldn't quite place. At exactly 8 a.m., the bell above the door jingled sharply, and Mr. Grayson entered, his face already flushed with anger. Gina trailed behind him, her expression smug and triumphant, a stark contrast to Ruth's growing apprehension. "Ruth," Mr. Grayson's voice cut through the air like a whip. "In my office, now." Ruth's stomach dropped, but she followed him without question. The tiny office in the back was cramped and suffocating, with stacks of invoices spilling onto the floor. Mr. Grayson stood behind the desk, arms crossed, his face a mixture of fury and disappointment. "What's going on?" Ruth asked cautiously, trying to keep her voice steady. "What's going on?" he repeated mockingly, slamming his hand on the desk. "Gina told me everything. You let a customer walk out without paying last night, and now we're short on the register." Ruth's eyes widened. "Mr. Grayson, I didn't. Don't interrupt me," he barked. "Do you think this is a charity? Do you think I can afford to let people just waltz in here and take advantage of us?" Ruth shook her head, her heart pounding. "It wasn't like that. He lost his wallet, and I told him he could come back to pay. I was trying to help someone in need." "Help someone in need?" Mr. Grayson scoffed. "This is a business, not a soup kitchen. Your job is to ensure customers pay, not hand out freebies." Ruth opened her mouth to defend herself, but Gina's voice came from the doorway, dripping with false concern. "I warned her, Mr. Grayson. She's too soft. Always has been." Ruth's fists clenched at her sides, but she kept her composure. "I've worked here for years without a single problem. You know I wouldn't do anything to hurt this place." Mr. Grayson shook his head, his decision already made. "I don't care. This is unforgivable. You're fired." The words hit Ruth like a blow to the chest. "Fired?" she echoed, disbelief and panic flooding her voice. "Mr. Grayson, please. I have a son to take care of. I can't afford." "Enough," he interrupted, turning away. "Clean out your locker. You're done here." Tears stung Ruth's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She gathered her things in silence, each step feeling heavier than the last. As she walked out, Gina smirked from behind the counter. "Told you that kindness would get you nowhere." She sneered. Ruth didn't respond. She stepped outside into the crisp morning air, clutching her small box of belongings. The reality of her situation hit her like a wave. She had no job, bills piling up, and a son, Daniel, whose medical needs couldn't wait. For the first time in years, she felt truly helpless. But as she walked home, one thought burned in her mind. She had done the right thing, and somehow, that had to mean something. The apartment was quiet, save for the sound of Daniel's laughter as he played with his toy cars on the worn carpet. Ruth sat cross-legged nearby, pretending to race along with him. But her mind was far away. Her smile faltered every time she thought about the bills piling up on the kitchen counter, the eviction notice folded in the drawer, and the empty fridge. She had spent the day scouring job boards, making calls, and visiting every diner and store in the area. But nothing had come through. "Mummy, look." Daniel's voice pulled her back. He held up a card triumphantly. "I won." "You did, sweetheart," she said, forcing cheerfulness into her tone. She ruffled his hair. "You're unstoppable." Daniel grinned, but Ruth could feel her chest tighten. How long could she keep pretending that everything was fine? How long before Daniel noticed the worry etched into her face? Her phone buzzed on the couch, startling her. She reached for it, expecting another rejection email or an overdue notice. But the screen displayed an unknown number. She frowned and opened the message. "I owe you a debt I can't repay. Can we meet?" Her brow furrowed. Before she could dismiss it as a mistake or a scam, another message arrived. A photo was attached. It showed her pouring coffee for the man from the diner last night. Her heart skipped a beat. How did this person have that photo? Why was this happening now? The next message came seconds later. "My name is Elon Musk." Ruth stared at the screen, her thoughts racing. This had to be a prank. Someone was playing a cruel joke. She almost deleted the message, but paused. What if it wasn't a joke? The photo couldn't have come from anyone else. Her fingers hovered over the screen. She felt a strange mix of fear and curiosity. Finally, she typed a response. "How do I know this is real?" The reply came instantly. "Let me prove it. Meet me tomorrow. I'll send a car." Ruth hesitated, staring at Daniel, who was now happily humming to himself as he played. This could be dangerous. But what if it wasn't? What if this was the miracle she so desperately needed? She bit her lip, weighing the risk. After a long moment, She sent her reply, "Where should I go?" The response was swift. "I'll send the details shortly. Thank you for your kindness." Ruth set the phone down, her mind spinning. Was this a cruel trick or something extraordinary? As Daniel climbed into her lap, his arms wrapped around her neck, she decided, if there was even the slightest chance this was real, she had to take it for Daniel, for herself, and for a glimmer of hope in the darkness. The black car that pulled up outside Ruth's apartment looked out of place in the modest neighborhood. It was sleek and polished, with tinted windows that reflected the faint morning sunlight. Ruth hesitated by the curb, holding Daniel's hand as he waved enthusiastically at the car. "Is this for us, Mommy?" he asked, his eyes wide with curiosity. "I think so," she replied, her voice unsteady. The driver, a sharply dressed man with a professional demeanor, stepped out and opened the door for her. "Miss Ruth?" he asked, tipping his cap. "Yes," she said, picking up Daniel and sliding into the spacious back seat. The interior smelled of leather and faintly of expensive cologne. As the car pulled away, Ruth's nerves tightened. The drive into the city felt endless, each mile filled with a strange combination of anticipation and dread. When the car finally stopped in front of an upscale restaurant, Ruth's jaw nearly dropped. She had never been anywhere so elegant. The facade gleamed, and through the glass doors, she could see chandeliers and tables set with pristine white linens. "This can't be right," she whispered to herself. The driver opened her door. "This is the place. Ma'am, Mr. Musk is waiting inside." The name still felt surreal. Taking a deep breath, Ruth stepped out, adjusting her simple blouse and jeans. She felt underdressed and out of place, but there was no turning back. Inside, the restaurant was even more opulent. A hostess greeted her warmly and led her to a private dining area. Her heart raced as she turned the corner and saw him sitting at a table, casually dressed but unmistakable. Elon Musk stood as she approached, extending a hand with a disarming smile. "Ruth," he said, "it's good to see you again." She shook his hand, her own trembling slightly. I can't believe this. Is this some kind of joke?" "Not at all," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "Please, make yourself comfortable." Ruth sat, clutching her purse tightly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Why me? Why are you doing this?" Elon leaned forward, his expression sincere. "Because of what you did that night. You had no idea who I was, but you treated me with kindness and respect when I needed it most. That's rare, and I couldn't let it go unnoticed." She felt her cheeks flush. "It was just a cup of coffee," she said softly. "To you? Maybe," Elon replied. "But to me, it was a reminder of what humanity can be at its best." And after hearing about what happened to you because of it, his jaw tightened. "I want to help." Ruth blinked, unsure of how to respond. "Help? How?" Elon smiled. "I'd like to offer you a position in one of my companies, a managerial role in hospitality. You have the qualities I look for: empathy, integrity, and leadership. The job comes with a substantial salary and housing for you and your son." Her mind reeled. "Are you serious? I don't have the experience for something like that." "You do," he assured her. "You just don't realize it yet. Besides, I have resources to provide any training you might need. What matters is who you are, not just what's on your resume." Tears welled in Ruth's eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. This would change everything for me and my son. That's the idea," Elon said warmly. "But before you decide, there's one condition." She stiffened, worried about what might follow. "What is it?" "I'd like you to return to the diner with me. I think there's something important that needs to be said to the people there, and to yourself." Ruth's breath caught. She hadn't expected this. Back to the diner? He nodded. If you're willing, I'll be there with you. After a moment's hesitation, Ruth nodded. Okay, let's do it. Elon's smile widened. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Ruth felt hope blooming in her chest. The afternoon was unusually bright, the sunlight glinting off the polished Tesla parked in front of the small diner. Ruth stood by the passenger door, her pulse quickening as she stared at the familiar entrance. Memories of her years working there and the humiliation of being fired flooded her mind. She glanced at Elon, who stood beside her, calm and confident. "You're sure about this?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "Absolutely," he said, his tone reassuring. "This isn't just for them. It's for you, too." Taking a deep breath, Ruth stepped forward. The bell above the door jingled as they entered, drawing every pair of eyes toward them. Conversations halted mid-sentence. Forks paused halfway to mouths. Gina was the first to react. She froze, her eyes darting between Ruth and Elon, then widened in astonishment. Mr. Grayson, standing behind the counter, paled visibly. He recognized Elon immediately, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Ruth," Mr. Grayson stammered. Before he could continue, Elon stepped forward, his presence commanding the room. "Good afternoon, everyone," he said, his voice even but firm. "I don't usually make public appearances like this, but today is an exception. I'm here to talk about Ruth." A murmur swept through the diner. Ruth shifted uncomfortably but stayed silent, letting Elon take the lead. "This woman," Elon continued, gesturing to Ruth, "showed me kindness and humanity when I needed it most. She didn't know who I was or what I could offer her. She simply chose to help because it was the right thing to do." Gina's smirk faltered, and her gaze dropped to the floor. "But what I learned later," Elon went on, his eyes narrowing slightly, "was that her actions cost her dearly. She was fired for doing the very thing that makes her extraordinary, caring about people." The room was silent. Mr. Grayson's face was red now, his discomfort evident. "I didn't," he started, but Elon raised a hand to stop him. "Ruth's kindness isn't a weakness," Elon said, his tone growing sharper. "It's a strength, and it's something this world could use more of." He turned to Ruth, his expression softening. "I've offered Ruth a position in one of my companies, where she'll be treated with the respect and dignity she deserves." She has accepted. Ruth looked at the stunned faces around her, finally finding her voice. "I just wanted to do the right thing," she said quietly. "That's all I ever wanted." Mr. Grayson cleared his throat awkwardly. "Ruth, I think maybe I was too hasty. If you'd like, your job is still here. You can come back anytime." Ruth straightened her shoulders, her voice steady but resolute. "Thank you, Mr. Grayson, but I found something better, something I deserve." Gina, desperate to salvage her pride, stepped forward with a sugary smile. "Mr. Musk, I'd love to work for someone like you. Maybe theirs." Elon didn't even glance her way, his focus remaining on Ruth. "Let's go," he said gently, guiding her toward the door. As they stepped outside, Ruth felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She looked at Elon, gratitude brimming in her eyes. "Thank you for that. I didn't realize how much I needed it." Elon smiled. "You deserved it. And remember, you're just getting started." As they drove away, Ruth looked back at the diner one last time. She didn't feel anger or bitterness, only a deep sense of closure. She was finally ready to move on. The moving truck rumbled away, leaving Ruth standing in the driveway of her new home. It wasn't a mansion or a luxury estate, but to her, it was perfect, a cozy, two-story house with a small garden in front, nestled in a safe neighborhood. The pale blue shutters and neatly trimmed hedges made it feel warm and inviting, like a place where dreams could finally take root. Daniel raced past her, his laughter echoing through the crisp air as he bolted toward the front door. "Mommy, is this really ours?" he asked, turning back with wide, hopeful eyes. "It's really ours," Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion. She crouched to his level, pulling him into a tight hug. "This is our home now." The journey to this moment had been nothing short of a whirlwind. After accepting Elon's job offer, Ruth had been flown to the company headquarters for training. The position was more than she had imagined, managing hospitality services for high-profile events and executive teams. It came with a salary that seemed impossible to her only weeks ago, as well as health insurance comprehensive enough to cover all of Daniel's medical needs. The company had also arranged for this home, ensuring that Daniel would grow up in a stable and nurturing environment. Ruth had spent the last few weeks adjusting to the demands of her new role, balancing work with motherhood, and marveling at the transformation of her life. Inside, the house was bright and airy. Daniel explored every corner with boundless energy, running up the stairs to claim his room and shouting about how he could see the park from his window. Ruth followed him, taking in the details: the polished wood floors, the fresh paint, the spacious kitchen that practically begged for family dinners. As she unpacked boxes in the living room, her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a text from Elon. "Hope the move went smoothly. Let me know if you need anything." Ruth smiled, typing back a quick response. "Thank you again for everything. We're settling in just fine." Her gratitude was immeasurable. Elon hadn't just offered her a job. He had given her a second chance at life, one she never imagined possible. Later that evening, Ruth sat on the couch, watching Daniel play with his cars on the plush new rug. His laughter was unrestrained, his cheeks flushed with happiness. For the first time in years, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. "Mommy," Daniel said suddenly, looking up at her, "does this mean I can go to the big doctor now?" Ruth's breath hitched, and she smiled through her tears. "Yes, baby, you'll have the best doctors. They're going to take great care of you." Daniel beamed, crawling into her lap. "You're the best mommy ever," he whispered, resting his head against her chest. Her heart swelled, and she kissed his forehead. "And you're the best thing that's ever happened to me." The next day, Ruth woke up early, determined to make the most of this new chapter. She dressed Daniel for school, packed his lunch, and walked him to the bus stop. Watching the yellow bus pull away, she felt a pang of bittersweet pride. Her own day was filled with meetings and learning sessions. The corporate world was intimidating at first, but Ruth found herself thriving. Her natural ability to connect with people made her a perfect fit for the role, and her team respected her not just for her position, but for the compassion and resilience she brought to every interaction. By the end of her first month, Ruth had developed a rhythm. She was juggling work and motherhood with a confidence she never thought she'd possess. Daniel's health was improving, thanks to the specialists he now had access to, and his joy was contagious. One evening, as Ruth tucked Daniel into bed, he held her hand tightly. "Mommy, do you think we're going to stay happy forever?" She paused, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "I think happiness isn't about things staying perfect all the time," she said gently. "It's about finding the good in every day, even when things are hard. And I promise, no matter what, we'll always have each other." Daniel nodded sleepily, his small hand still clutching hers as he drifted off. Ruth stayed by his side a moment longer, reflecting on how far they had come. From the suffocating despair of losing her job to the unimaginable opportunity that had changed their lives. Every step had been a lesson in hope, faith, and resilience. The path ahead still held uncertainties, but Ruth felt ready. For the first time in years, she wasn't just surviving, she was living. And the possibilities felt endless. The scent of fresh produce and baked bread filled the air as Ruth guided her cart through the aisles of the neighborhood market. It had become a weekly ritual, shopping on Saturday mornings with Daniel by her side, his tiny hands reaching for his favorite snacks. Today, he was tugging on her arm, pointing excitedly to a box of cookies displayed at the end of the aisle. "Mummy, can we get those? Please," Daniel begged, bouncing on his toes. Ruth smiled, her heart warm at his enthusiasm. "You've been such a good helper today. I think you've earned a treat." She grabbed the box and placed it in the cart, ruffling his hair as he grinned up at her. As they turned the corner toward the dairy section, Ruth suddenly froze, standing a few feet away, wearing a faded green apron and scanning a customer's groceries. Was Gina. The years had not been kind to her former coworker. Her once perfectly styled blonde hair was now streaked with gray and tied back in a loose ponytail. Her face looked tired. The sharpness that had once defined her expressions softened by a weariness Ruth recognized all too well. Gina glanced up from the register, her eyes landing on Ruth. A flicker of something surprise, embarrassment, maybe even regret crossed her face. Ruth wasn't sure if she should turn around and walk away or face the moment head-on. Before she could decide, Gina spoke, her voice hesitant. "Ruth, is that you?" Ruth nodded, offering a polite but guarded smile. "Hi, Gina." Gina wiped her hands on her apron and stepped out from behind the counter, leaving her customer waiting. She approached slowly, as though unsure how to proceed. "Wow, I can't believe it. It's been years, hasn't it?" "Almost 3, Ruth replied. She gestured toward Daniel, who was busy inspecting a box of cereal. "This little guy's grown a lot since you last saw him." Gina's eyes flickered to Daniel and back to Ruth. "You look different. Better. I mean, life must be treating you well." Ruth hesitated, wondering how much to say. "It's been good," she said finally. "A lot's changed since I left the diner." The sun hung high in the sky, casting a warm golden light over the neighborhood park. Children ran across the open fields, their laughter mingling with the sound of birdsong and the distant hum of passing cars. Ruth sat on a wooden bench, her hands resting on her lap as she watched Daniel climb the jungle gym with boundless energy. The park had become a favorite weekend destination for them. It was a simple joy, one that Ruth now cherished more than ever. She couldn't stop marveling at how much her life had changed in the past few years. Daniel reached the top of the climbing structure and waved down at her. "Mommy, look, I'm the king of the castle." "You sure are," she called back, smiling brightly. The past few months had been a blur of milestones and gratitude. Ruth had settled into her role as manager of hospitality with a confidence she never imagined possible. The job wasn't without its challenges, coordinating events for high-profile clients, managing staff, and dealing with the occasional mishap, but she thrived in the fast-paced environment. Her success hadn't gone unnoticed. Elon himself had checked in with her regularly, offering guidance and encouragement. At one point, during a quiet moment in his office, he had remarked, "I knew you'd be great, but you've surpassed even my expectations." Those words had stayed with Ruth, fueling her determination. And then there was Daniel, with access to the best medical care. His health had improved dramatically. The worry that had once haunted Ruth's every waking moment had been replaced with hope and joy. Daniel was thriving, his energy boundless, his laughter infectious. Ruth glanced toward the picnic blanket where a cooler and a basket of sandwiches waited. She had packed all of Daniel's favorites, peanut butter and jelly, apple slices, and the cookies he had begged for during their last shopping trip. Daniel slid down the bright yellow slide, his sneakers hitting the mulch with a soft crunch. He ran toward Ruth, his cheeks flushed from exertion. "Mommy, can we eat now? I'm so hungry." She laughed and stood, brushing off her jeans. "I thought you'd never ask." They settled onto the blanket, and Ruth handed him a sandwich. As they ate, Daniel chattered excitedly about a new friend he'd made at school. A boy named Leo who loved dinosaurs as much as he did. "And guess what, Mummy?" Daniel said, his mouth full of apple slices. "Leo's dad said we can go to the museum next weekend to see the dinosaur skeletons." Ruth smiled, her heart swelling. "That sounds amazing. We'll have to take lots of pictures." Daniel nodded enthusiastically, then grew quiet for a moment. "Mommy, do you think we'll always be this happy?" The question caught Ruth off guard. She set down her sandwich and looked at him, her expression softening. "Happiness isn't something we hold on to forever, sweetheart," she said gently. "It's something we create every day by being kind and grateful and taking care of each other. And as long as we do that, I think we'll have a lot of happy days." Daniel seemed to consider this, then smiled. "I like happy days." Ruth leaned over and kissed the top of his head. "Me too, baby. Me too." As they finished their meal, Ruth stretched out on the blanket. Looking up at the sky, clouds drifted lazily overhead, their shapes shifting in the breeze. Daniel lay beside her, pointing out a cloud that he said looked like a dragon. "See the wings, Mommy?" he asked, tracing them with his finger. "I see them," she replied, her voice soft. For a moment, they lay in comfortable silence, the kind of silence that only comes from feeling completely at peace. Ruth thought about the journey that had brought her here, the hardships, the unexpected kindness of a stranger, the choices that had led her to this very moment. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, breaking the quiet. She pulled it out and saw a message from Elon. "New project coming up. I'd like you to lead it. Let's discuss Monday. Congrats again on your latest success." She smiled, shaking her head slightly. Even now, the opportunities seemed endless. "Who's that, Mummy?" Daniel asked, leaning over to peek at the screen. "Just a friend," she said, ruffling his hair. "One who believed in us." As the sun began to set, casting the park in shades of amber and rose, Ruth packed up their things. Daniel insisted on carrying the cooler, though it was nearly as big as he was. They walked home together, hand in hand, their shadows stretching long behind them. Ruth felt a sense of completeness she hadn't known was possible. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid of it. Her journey wasn't just a testament to the power of kindness. It was proof that even in the darkest times, light could find its way through. And as she watched Daniel skip ahead, laughing and carefree, Ruth knew one thing for certain: the best was yet to come.